Hello, and welcome back to Politics and Polls. I'm Julian Zelizer, a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University. Today, my colleague and co-host Sam Wang won't be able to join us. One of the conversations that we have been following throughout the current presidency, certainly since the election of 2016, but even before, is the state and health of our democracy, how representative institutions are working, where there are serious problems that we are facing which go beyond the current president. And while a great deal of journalism tends to focus on the here and now of what happens in the morning or what happens on the Twitter feed, I think there's many people, observers, politicians who are trying to go much deeper and trying to understand the state and strains that our representative system faces and how we came to be this way. We've been trying to hold discussions on this issue to gain a deeper understanding of what the problems are that we face as a democracy, even after the 2020 election. Today, our guest is David Litt, who is a New York Times best-selling author. He's the author of Thanks, Obama, My Hopey, Changey White House Years. From 2011 to 2016, David wrote speeches for President Obama and was described as the, quote, comic muse for the president for his work on the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Since leaving the White House, he served as the head writer and producer for Funny or Die's office in Washington, with a focus on improving youth turnout in the 2018 election, and is currently developing a sitcom based on his life in Washington. You can see him on the news, on CNN, MSNBC, and elsewhere, discussing how events are unfolding. But today we're here to discuss his new book, Democracy in One Book or Less: How It Works, Why It Doesn't, and Why Fixing It Is Easier Than You Think, which is out with HarperCollins and is really a terrific read. So I'm excited to have some time to talk about what he has written. So David, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So maybe we can just start with the basic question of why you decided to write the book and why you decided to give us a primer, so to speak, on where representative democracy is.
I decided to write this book. It really came down to a flash of insight that I had, I guess you could call it an insight, during Trump's inauguration. So on Inauguration Day, it also happened to be my wife's birthday. And so we went to Disney World, which was the one place where we felt like we could celebrate my wife's birthday and not have to see the inauguration on TV. And of course, I was just following it on my phone obsessively anyway. And I was just struck by, on one hand, and we all know this, but I hadn't really let it sink in, that we had a president that the majority of the American people did not want, they didn't vote for. We also had a Senate where the majority of Americans had wanted one party to be in charge and the other party was in charge. And in the House, I think the Republicans did win the overall election for House in 2016, but not by very much, and they were about to take this huge majority. What was stunning to me about this was not that it was so shocking, but how incredibly normal this was. So over and over again, when I worked in the Obama White House, I ran into this exact same situation. The American people want one thing, and their government gives them the opposite. And that's true on so many different issues, on gun safety, on climate change, on the economy, over and over again. It's true right now as we're discussing this on COVID and on policing as well, and on issues involving racial justice. And so I just remember having this thought of, how would you explain this to a Martian, or a Belgian, right? Just that we have a democracy, but yet the things that the people want and that the experts agree would be good for America aren't happening. So this book was my attempt to answer that question, to try to figure out, why is there this disconnect between what we the people want and what we keep getting from our government?
But you start with you just started with the 2016 election, but I assume some of this grew out of your time in the White House and the experience of working for a president and seeing, and maybe I'm wrong, but seeing some of how the process played out during those pretty critical years post 2010 midterms.
Yeah, I started in the White House in 2011. And so I only got to experience, and I should be clear, it was a great experience, but it only took place in the context of a dysfunctional government where we could not get stuff done through the normal schoolhouse rock legislative process. The challenge that we kept facing was you think that there's a government that fundamentally people find common ground and agree, and that's certainly a lot of what President Obama ran on in 2008. But over and over again, we kept running into this dysfunction that was not an accident. It was intentional dysfunction. And this is one of the most important things that I think about. So I'm 33, but if you're casting your first vote, if you're 18 or 20 and casting your first vote in this election, you have only seen government that's dysfunctional under Democrats or disastrous under Republicans. And those are it seems like those are the only two options. And so particularly for people just a couple years younger than I am, there's a reason people are losing faith, I think, in our democracy, because they look at it and say, this is not delivered.
And we have, despite my introduction, surprise co-host Sam Wang is able to join us. And he's on the line as well. Sam?
Hi there.
Oh, excellent. So joining us mid-interview, a first for politics and polls. Let me
heavy traffic in Princeton. Sorry about that.
No problem. Let me follow up though with a question that builds on the dysfunction, the intentional dysfunction. And as we're recording this, I was just looking. Jon Stewart, he had a tweet or he had an interview yesterday where he talked a little bit about this kind of theme and how Republicans at some level are comfortable. They are a party that doesn't mind the dysfunction. It doesn't contradict their basic philosophy about government. But one question is, and I'm curious your thoughts, why do Republicans support policies that don't really have majority support? Why are they almost intent not only on dysfunction, but on a coalition that's smaller than what they might otherwise achieve?
I think the thing that I did not realize before I started writing this book is that it actually goes back to a fight between John Adams and Ben Franklin in the 1770s. And probably in some ways it goes back even before that, but we'll just start with those two. So you had Adams, who represented what at the time was the majority American view, which was that, they were pretty liberal about voting rights compared to other systems that were in place at the time, but they still felt that most people should not vote. There should be property requirements for voting. Certainly, if you weren't white and male, you're in most places you couldn't vote. Then you had Ben Franklin, and this was mostly a fight over property requirements. And he basically said, voting is something that's an intrinsic right. It's not something that you only get because you're a certain kind of person. It's just something that you get. And most of us today agree with Ben Franklin. In fact, we would go much further than Ben Franklin and say every adult who lives in America should be able to vote. If you're part of this country, you should have a say in how it's run. But our political process is still designed for a John Adams type world where voting is a privilege and not a right. And so one of the reasons, there are a number of answers to your question, but one of the reasons why I think Republicans consistently support policies that do not have majority support is because they think they can get to a majority of voters, even if they don't get to a majority of Americans. And because of the way our election laws are structured and our political process is structured, that's much more doable than it might otherwise be. It's not always doable, but it's certainly a viable strategy in a way it shouldn't be if you thought that voting was a right.
Can I just jump? I want to jump in on that, and then I'm going to turn to Sam. But when you wrote speeches, part of what you were doing was trying to communicate through the president, help the president communicate to as broad a public as possible, to sell his message through humor or otherwise. As time grew in the White House, were you thinking of the problems you outline in the book in terms of what you were doing as a speechwriter?
I really wasn't, because one of the things that I found in the White House is even in well-run White Houses, the urgent almost always takes precedence over the important. And so, at the time that we had a healthcare website that was, crashing and we needed to do something about, and we were thinking about how to talk to people about that. The president wore a tan suit at one point, and that was a legitimate scandal back in the good old days. And so that was the news cycle. So this was happening beneath the surface. And I think to a large extent, we didn't fully appreciate it. I mean, I think if you looked at the president's farewell address, which was a really poignant speech, but he focused on democracy issues. I think in a way saying, we've made all this progress, but the one thing, and I think he said something almost exactly like this, but probably more eloquent than I'm going to say it now. The one thing we didn't really do was figure out how to make sure that our democracy is healthy. We restored the economy. We brought healthcare to millions of people. We wound down these wars. What we did not do was figure out how to make sure that the underlying system can keep us on the right track going forward. And I think that became very, very clear once Trump won. And I think both the president and most people I know who worked for him were very quick to recognize that President Trump is not a cause of all this. He's a symptom of it as much as he's a cause.
But at some level, this is, on the long historical arc, a recent expectation that somehow there should be majority rule. I mean, the civil rights era in the 1960s was really the modern implementation of the idea that people of all races should vote. Women got the vote in 1920. And so we're talking about this arc of history. And so I think at some level, it feels like the benchmark here that you're measuring against is, say, what we thought democracy was going to be, say, around 1970 to 1980.
So first of all, I like the surprise co-host, and B, a surprise co-host with tough questions. This is a podcast first for me. And I like that. And I think that's a really important point and a really important question, because I do, in the book, to a large extent, say, how has democracy changed in my lifetime? That is really and the reason I did that, and to some extent the last 40 years. So, from Reagan until now. And one of the reasons I did that was because it shocked me. I'm 33 years old. I would have thought that things were roughly the same. You don't think about the arc of history taking place during one's life, especially when you hope that you're still in the beginning of that. And yet, our democracy is a completely different place. Our political process is completely different than it was when I was a kid. But the other point I would say is that what you just said is right. We have always, this is a new conception, this idea that everyone should vote. The idea that we're a majoritarian country, I think, is not new, but the question is, who gets to count in that majority? So, if you looked at what the founders and framers, what a Madison would have said about majority rule, I think he was for a majority of voters getting more or less what they want most of the time. But who gets to count in that group was a much, much, much smaller slice, including, of course, the original Sin of America that James Madison, to use just one example, had these eloquent and profound ideas about democracy and yet enslaved human beings. So I think there is one of the things that I think is hopeful and that makes me think that we may still be able to continue to make progress going forward is that our conception of democracy today is, I think, much more small d democratic than at most times in our history. And I say this in the introduction of the book. If you were a labor organizer in the early 1900s, or you were a civil rights leader in the Jim Crow South, you would happily trade places for our democracy with our democracy today. So the question is not whether, it's that we've backslid for the last 40 years to a large extent, rather than that we are, still mired where we were, let's say, in the 1770s.
Well, I wanted to ask a little bit about reforms and of course the problems that we haven't really put a finger on specifically. I think of a lot of these shenanigans and strategies used to distort outcomes of elections and policies as being what a constitutional scholar, Mark Tushnet, has called constitutional hardball, where you use the rules of the game and you play literally by the rules, and then you gain yourself a small advantage. And so where you just tilt the playing field just a tiny bit. And it's like shimming up the playing field just a little bit, putting up wedges one at a time to create a tilt. And I wonder if we could talk about what some of these wedges are and what one could do to pull out the wedge, because presumably we're hoping to de-tilt the field, aren't we?
That's exactly right. One of the things I think was really stunning to me, if there's kind of not a hero of the book certainly, but a protagonist of the book, I guess one would be me, since I do a bunch of travel and and a lot of research. But the other would be Mitch McConnell. And I feel like Mitch McConnell is the foremost proponent of constitutional hardball in the United States. That, you know, he even titled his memoir "The Long Game," which for a politician is a very amoral memoir title. And I think that's what he recognized, that if you use the rules, you can also rewrite the rules. And you know, within the framework of what you can get away with, you can make these little changes, just as you've described, and that gradually completely changes the system. So it's very different than Mitch McConnell's old favorite sport, which was baseball, where, you know, in baseball, the players don't get to write the rules of the game. In politics, they do.
So, master of the Senate, master of rules and of hardball, and not letting anything through the Obama years, and then getting extra Supreme Court justices for his side in Trump years. Okay, so let's fast forward a little bit to things that could happen were somebody to get in control of the rules in the Senate, in the White House, at any level. What kinds of things would you suggest as reforms in January 2021, if such an opportunity were to arise?
So the thing that I talk about in the book is something I call the Skywalker window. So that's this idea that the way that change really is going to happen is not the sort of, unfortunately, frankly, it's not the slow deliberative process that I think we were often taught about when we were kids. Right now, the way that change happens is basically the end of episode 4 of Star Wars, right? You get one tiny shot at one very small, quickly vanishing opportunity. But if you make that shot, everything changes very, very quickly. And so to me, what we need to be thinking about, and I'm a Democrat here, so when I say we, I mean Democrats, is how do you, the point is not to create a system, to your point about constitutional hardball, where Democrats win every election. But the point is to create a system where you have fair elections, where you have outcomes that reflect, again, what people want. And so a couple of things right off the bat. You know, I wrote about the filibuster for this book, the Senate filibuster, and I went into this thinking, probably I will be a very reasonable person who says that what we ought to do is reform the Senate filibuster, maybe bring the threshold for passing a bill down from 60 votes to 55 votes or something like that. I ended up thinking that if we get the opportunity, we need to remove the legislative filibuster entirely. And along with that, we also
You're going to need a lot of Democrats for that, because there are old Democrats who don't like that. So you got to get like 53, 54 Democrats. Otherwise, God only knows, like Manchin or somebody is going to say, no, don't want to do that.
That's going to be a huge fight. And I think it's going to be an important fight, because the danger is if you say, well, we'll wait till things get really bad, then you've spent all your political capital. And so you're not going to be able to do it once everyone agrees it needs to be done.
Wait until things are really bad.
Was that a looking around like things are really bad now? Or let me explain what I meant by that. What I mean by that is that if you take your first 100 days, the window in which it's easiest to get things done with a new administration, and you say, well, we'll just test it out. We'll see whether Mitch McConnell will allow us to pass laws this time around. Then I think what you're going to find is you're going to have a lot of difficulty doing that. But by the time people have finally come around and said, okay, this is ridiculous, we need to do something about the legislative process so it actually functions, you've used that window testing the waters, and it's a lot harder to get stuff done. So I don't think it's impossible, but I think it's important to move quickly. And I think that the other piece of that is, and this was what ultimately convinced me of this, the sense that I got when I talked to a variety of experts about this, who all agreed that if you get rid of the legislative filibuster, there will be unintended consequences. But they all basically said the moment that Mitch McConnell and Republicans feel that getting rid of the legislative filibuster advantages them, they're going to do it. So it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. The question is, who's in charge when the legislative filibuster goes, and what do they do with that new ability to pass laws? And my view would be, what you do with that new ability to pass laws is you start to implement some of the other ideas that I talk about in the book: stronger public financing for campaigns, automatic voter registration, enfranchising former felons, immigration reform. So a variety of things that are designed to level the playing field that you can only do once you get rid of the legislative filibuster.
And then there's been only a few moments in American history where there is substantive reform. And you outline in your book campaign finance, filibuster, gerrymandering, a whole plate of problems that we face. And so I think, well, in the progressive era, we had a lot of reforms. In the 1970s, you had an era of reform. That's really about it, other than then kind of spotty moments where you deal with one issue or the other. So then the question is, what leads the people in power, like a McConnell, to say, I'm done with this. It's not in my interest anymore. And it could be a huge, massive scandal. It could be an electoral defeat that's so devastating that they change their ways. Or, as you talk about, it could be voting. And youth voting is something that's very important. How do you get young people to not only turn out on the streets, but turn out to vote, and to turn out in the kind of numbers that would allow them to translate their frustration, your generation and younger, with how the system works, into real political change in Washington? How does that work? How does what we're seeing now in protest kind of switch over to that, if at all?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I wish I could say, here's the answer. I've worked on this issue, and I think in 2018, we saw youth turnout increase substantially. Now that's from, absolutely atrocious to merely dismal, right? But the difference between atrocious youth turnout and dismal youth turnout is the difference between one version of America and another version of America, because youth turnout is so low that even small incremental improvements would make a giant difference in the country if young people turned out just slightly more relative to older voters. Now, that said, I think the most important thing, if I was sitting down and saying, how do we plan a youth turnout campaign? I think at this point, the question becomes, how do you get people to recognize the connection between what happens in elections and their lives? And I think the way to do that, frankly, is to start with local elections. So the national election, who's the president, I think that is important, but I think Democrats have often focused too much just on who's the president, and we've left all of these other down-ballot races ignored. And so I think the question is going to become, how do you get young people to care about who's on your city council, who's your state legislator, who's your mayor? And I do think we're seeing that with these protests. I mean, the focus on local elections and the understanding that is growing of, hey, these policing laws that are not serving our communities, they weren't made in Washington, or at least they weren't all made in Washington. A lot of them were done at the state level, or a lot of them are city policies. The other thing that I think is really important for youth turnout and for as young people go to vote in particular, is to recognize that some of these reforms are also turnout measures. So ranked choice voting, I think, is a very good example. Ranked choice voting, I imagine if you listen to a podcast like this, you already know, but where you get to go into the voting booth and you don't just pick one favorite candidate, you rank your candidates, and then it makes sure that your vote ultimately counts. Now, the thing about ranked choice voting that we don't often talk about is that, to me, it's also a turnout measure, because one of the main reasons people don't vote, in addition to all of the hoops they have to jump through that I talk about in the book, people think that their vote is not really going to matter that much. It's not, or that they don't get to support the person they really believe in. So ranked choice voting means you can show up in the voting booth. You don't have to choose between voting for your favorite candidate and making sure your vote counts. You can do both. And I think you're going to see a lot more young people in particular go vote if they can express their values and also make sure their vote counts. And I think
feels like part of the problem there is that people who you're trying to reach really focus on the national picture, and the national picture requires focusing on the presidency. Yet all these ways in which one's vote matters, local DA races, city council races, board of education, all of these matter quite, I have to say, like when I vote locally, my vote actually matters and it motivates me. And Republicans are pretty good at noticing their local community in ways that Democrats are not. And so it feels like that you're now at this point on the edge of saying that people on the liberal end of the spectrum need to fundamentally rethink where their priorities are in terms of how they vote and where they vote.
I think that I wouldn't actually say rethink their priorities. I would just say expand, right? You need to add to the list, because of course the president matters. That's important. But I think all these other things matter also. And I think on a donor level, for example, that may require, if you came to me and said, I'm going to give, $100 to a candidate, do I give it to, and I want to support a Democrat, do I give it to Joe Biden? I would say no, give it to someone down ballot who's going to have a much harder time raising money and where that $100 is going to matter more. On a voting level, I think it's just a matter of making voting habitual in every election. What you're describing of, voting in your DA's race. And I will say, I just wrote a book about democracy. I've worked in politics for a decade, maybe more than a decade at this point. And I often don't know the difference between, I know the basics about my local officials, but I go into the voting booth and sometimes I see a ballot measure and I say, I don't really understand what this does. So it is hard. And the other thing I will say, there's a weird combination because one reason young people don't vote is because they don't think their vote matters. And another reason is they don't think they know enough to cast an informed vote. I feel like the easy proof that it's okay to vote without knowing everything is like, turns out you can be president and be kind of a dummy these days. So I think you can certainly cast a ballot. But I do think that those two things are in tension. You need to figure out a way where people say, I care about these things, and I'm also willing to make my best judgment, even if I don't know everything. That's okay. Participating in democracy does not require like an advanced degree. It's something that all of us should be able to do.
How do you think, can I ask you, I'm thinking about what you're saying, and Sam and I often are talking about issues like gerrymandering or the filibuster, and it's interesting to those who are interested, and this is a story I've seen throughout my career. It's hard to translate these matters to a broader public. You use humor. I mean, you used humor with the president in crafting his speeches. This book has a tone that's fun, even though you're talking about weighty issues and you're involved in sitcom writing, et cetera, et cetera. How important are the tools of communication and maybe thinking differently about how we discuss these pertinent issues to ultimately mobilizing support for fixing the system?
Well, you're getting at the heart of why I decided to write a book about this stuff, because I'm not an expert in any of it. And, I'm talking to two experts here. I am not an academic. I think if you had, either of you had been my professor during when I was a college student, you would be very glad to know that I do not pretend to be an academic. And at the same time, I have spent a long time now thinking about how to take issues that people may or may not care about intrinsically and translate them and explain them in a way where people say, oh, this is interesting and it matters. And I thought that was very, very important to do. I wanted to write a book about structural democracy reform without ever once using the phrase structural democracy reform. That was very important to me because I do think that one of the things that I learned, and I spoke to some extraordinary political reformers with great ideas that are important, and yet it seems like the political reform movement is determined to make its ideas seem as uninspiring and unimportant as possible. And so the way we talk about these things really does get back to this fundamental promise of the country, which is, if you're an American, do you have a say in your country's future? And, that basic question, that matters to people. And all of these things we're talking about, right? Gerrymandering is not just about drawing up districts. It's about making sure that your vote doesn't really have an impact in an election. It's about taking your little slice of power that you get as an American and removing it from you. The urgency of it, I think, does come through in that way. And then you also talked about humor. And for me, I just know that I won't get through a book about something like this unless I'm enjoying reading it. And so to me, the most fun parts of the book to write, and also, I would imagine, I hope the parts that people enjoy reading too, are some of the historical tidbits, right? Like, I got surprisingly into the history of Polish folklore and vampires while discussing the Senate filibuster. Turns out that the structure of the Senate has a lot to do with James Madison and Gunning Bedford Jr., who were at Princeton college roommates and did not get along, at least not at the convention. And so some of the stories, especially from the past, to me kind of brought this stuff alive. And I found like the story of our political process is not just kind of the story of institutions or the story of ideas and principles. There are characters in it. And these are people who are just like trying to figure it out. And I find that both entertaining and also inspiring in its own way, because I feel like today there are people just trying to figure it out. And it gives me some hope that maybe we can do it.
Tell me a good gerrymander joke. or a good filibuster joke? No, really, come on, hit me.
So this is not a joke book. I should be very clear. I think that's the danger of telling anybody that you do dip even a toe in comedy is they say, okay, well, tell me a joke.
5 precincts walked into a bar. Like
Yeah, exactly. Yes, I think by the end of this, we will have to figure out, right, some good classic gerrymandering jokes. But for example, you talked about, I think like gerrymandering, this is the way I talk about gerrymandering, and this whole section of the book about whose vote counts is a story about an election. It's a presidential election. In 1947, I believe, my grandfather ran for president of his public high school in Brooklyn. And he used to tell me this story over and over and over again when he was still alive. He would, and he told it as though he had actually run for president. Like,
say your grandfather's name. Let's hear his name.
So his name was Irving Litt. Irving
Litt. Okay, good.
And he would say to me, so I went all over the school. I put up all my flyers, and I've talked with candidates, and I've heard them talk about their first campaign, and it sounded the same. And so, he'd say, I put up all my flyers, I talked to all my friends, and all of my flyers had this great slogan, score a hit with Irv Litt. It was a very 1940s, the presidential campaign. And then he'd cut, and then he said, then I came into school the next day, and my main rival had taken down all my signs, and he put up all these other signs, and they all said, take a shit with Irv Litt. And then he would kind of get quiet because he's a very serious guy. And I think it was like the most I ever really saw him smile. And at least, when talking about serious issues like this, and he would kind of like half smile, and then he would say, but the thing is, when they held the election, everybody only knew my name, take a shit with Irv Litt. So I won. And I feel like, I love that story. And again, I want to make clear, that's not a joke. If you're listening to this podcast and you're not laughing out loud, I hope you were entertained, which is, I think, the more important thing. And when writing jokes for politicians, that's always my view as well, right? Engaging is more important than hilarious.
I see. So you think the Republican candidate could pull his candidacy out with like something that rhymes Trump with dump?
No, I think Democrats tried that, unfortunately, and it did not work at a national level.
Did Biden? No.
No, I don't think so. But here's what I do think. I think so. First of all, that was my first introduction to the importance of name recognition in down ballot races, which is a different question. The thing that I thought was really interesting about that story was how the part that my grandfather never had to talk about. Right, so he never had to say everybody's vote in that election in Abraham Lincoln High School in Brooklyn in 1947 counted equally to everyone else's. We just assumed that. If you Sam or Julian, if you said, oh, I was just elected, I don't know what your hobbies are, but the president of my
school board,
president of my school board, you assume that. And yet our most important elections are conducted in a way where everyone's vote counts differently. So again, like thinking about what we expect and what we get, this assumption that my vote and your vote count equally to each other is baked into so many of our decisions and so many of our elections, and yet our most important elections don't function that way. And so that wasn't just about gerrymandering, which does create that disconnect between votes, but it's also how the Senate works, how the Electoral College works. And to me, it was important that as I started to think about these issues, to say not just what's going on, but what are the principles at stake? What are the ideas here? And how do we introduce those ideas in a way that is let's just put it this way. I think I set out to write the most entertaining book about political science. And I think by that low bar, I feel pretty good about it.
We're almost out of time, but let me ask you this question. When I read your book, one of the things that came through was, boy, here's someone who's still optimistic. Meaning you walk us through an incredible number of serious problems, from voting disenfranchisement to a dysfunctional Congress at some level. But the point of your book is we can fix this, we can move forward. You come from a White House that exuded some of that, I think, at many points. He still does, President Obama. I think that's why it's often refreshing to hear him, whatever party you're in. And yet, there's a rage on the streets where many protesters are kind of cynical that politics will change anything. You hear that often. Can you just kind of, and this is personal, but where does that sense of optimism about politics, about democracy come from? from you. How do you think about it, and why are you still so confident that fixing it is easier than you think, as the subtitle of your book ends with?
Well, I have to say, I wish I was an optimist by temperament. I think, I wrote for a president who I think was an optimist by temperament, and I admire that. I'm someone who just would describe himself as a realist, and probably my friends and family would call me a pessimist. So for me, I wanted to really look into this question, because my optimism is rooted in two things when it comes to the long-term future of America. I think that should be that's an important distinction. I'm not a short-term optimist. I don't think that a month from now, things are going to be substantially better, or 2 months from now, or even if Joe Biden wins and there's a big Democratic wave, 6 months after that, we're still going to be doing some serious work. The reason that I remain an optimist is because, to me, the basic question of America is, can we change ourselves? I think Stephen Sondheim in a song described America as an idea about tomorrow, this idea that we can change ourselves tomorrow. And part of it is the recognition that for most of human history and in much of the world today, that is not an option to people. No matter how much you want to change your own circumstances, your own country's circumstances, that option is precluded to you. In America, we still have that chance. We still have that opportunity. And so the question I went into looking at the issues in this book, and they are serious problems, is, can we fix the political process using the political process? So we have these broken institutions in many cases, but can we fix them using those same institutions without tearing them down and trying to start from scratch? Because I do believe if you tear them down and start from scratch, people who are currently without power, they're not going to come out on top of that process. I think that's unlikely. And so in every case when I looked at this, what I kept finding was there are things we can do that do not require a constitutional amendment. There are things we can do that don't require Mitch McConnell to suddenly grow a heart and require a Paul Ryan type to grow a spine. All we have to do is win one big election, get that Skywalker window I talked about earlier in the podcast, and pass a series. Sorry?
The ventilation shaft.
Yeah, exactly. We have to open. I'm trying to figure out exactly how deep to go into this analogy, and we need to. That's exactly right. For those listening, that was a mime of a. Now I'm losing. This is the limits of my Star Wars knowledge. My wife is a big Star Wars person, so I don't know what they're aiming at the ventilation shaft. The point being that I think that if we open up that window and we take that opportunity and we pass a series of laws, it's not going to fix everything, but it will put us back on track to being able to say we can solve our problems together as a country, and that's no small thing. And that's what makes me hopeful about our future.
So we are unfortunately out of time, but I want to thank our guest. It's David Litt, who now we know comes from a long political family. And his new book, it's really wonderful, Democracy in One Book or Less, How It Works, Why It Doesn't, and Why Fixing It is Easier Than You Think. It goes through so many issues that Sam and I talk about all the time, but in a really accessible, informative way, and points us toward that long, better future. The book is out everywhere. It's available. HarperCollins published it. If you're seeing this on YouTube, this is the cover. So David, thanks so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here on with both of you.
And once again, you can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Spotify. Most important, you can also visit our website, politicspolls.princeton.edu, with information, show archives, contact material, and everything else you need. And the Woodrow Wilson website also has the latest podcast available. So everyone, thanks for joining us, and we'll be back soon on Politics and Polls.
Hey, go register to vote, everybody. Vote.org. Bye.